Like, there were
Testing,
people
1, 2.
comments, so I'm sure there's some
Testing,
people
1, 2.
Oh yeah.
that
Yeah.
definitely had like a lot of
Some people posted on Twitter actually.
yeah, I bet
Yeah.
they did. But like there
There's
was a
going
few-
to need to be so much editing.
yeah,
So many cameras.
kidding.
Okay.
I saw that.
Yeah, there's people running around. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on time. Sorry, I didn't have everything quite set up in time, but this is part 2 of DJ History and Technology. Again, I'm Philip Tan. I've been doing this for a while, but not necessarily all of the information that I'm presenting you today is things that I've always known as a DJ. In fact, this is roughly stuff I had to gather over, piecemeal over time. And in particular, what we're going to be doing today, last week we talked about analog mixers and I played some hip hop breaks. Today we'll be talking about vinyl records and turntables. So, these things and the DJ culture around them. Obviously, there's also people who just listen to records at home, a lot of people who just listen to records at home, people who play records on the radio, jukeboxes which play records automatically. And I wouldn't be going so much into those, except in the cases where it actually intersects with what DJs were doing. And again, I'm referring to dance floor DJs, not necessarily folks on the radio or playing for your friends, just for scope reasons. So again, looking at DJ's workspace, that giant container over there full of records, right, and all of the sleeves being piled up. By the way, I do have some records at the back, and I do want to point out this particular one, the Carmen. It's very, very heavy. And part of the reason, of course, is that it's an album. It's a real album. There's several records in there. But the other thing is it's not made out of vinyl. So this is kind of the end, the change of the records that you have in here to the records that we have in the other sleeves is kind of where our story starts. These are made out of shellac. And let's see, I think it's actually an organic compound that's actually harvested from real bugs secreting stuff, and then it has it's kind of like a natural plastic. But it turns out to have useful military uses, at least in World War II, and as a result, a lot of these records were actually recollected by various governments and melted back down for war purposes. But last week I promised that I'd actually have a picture of some of the earlier DJs before the time that I'm talking about. So over here, Ron Diggins, Boston, 1947, but that's Boston in Lincolnshire, UK, not Massachusetts, where he's operating two 78 RPM record players with a wind-up hand crank. I'm not sure if you can actually see the hand cranks over there, but that's what it looks like on the other side of this giant jukebox-looking thing that he called a degola. Eventually, obviously, he started in 1947, but he didn't stop DJing at that point of time. But he would upgrade it to using actual vinyl turntables and electronic amplification and things like that. Another problem that you have with shellac records like this, I think this is the record that I'm thinking. No, this one's actually in pretty good case. One of these records in here has a giant crack down the middle. And that's a problem with shellac records, is that they break really, really easily. They're very brittle, and they're very heavy. They feel like ceramic when you pick them up. Sorry, one of these records, well, maybe you'll find it as you take a look at it, but one of them has just this giant line straight down the center. Anyway, if anybody, does anyone want to take a look at it while I'm handing it out? Yeah, it's a bit dusty. It's probably decades and decades and decades old. Well, most of these records are actually decades old. Folks all the way back to 1941 were actually playing records just like this for dance purposes. Only, of course, we're talking waltzes and foxtrots and things like that. Right after the war. Oh gosh, I got dust all over me. Yeah. Oh, you found it? Okay, all right, yeah, it's a big line straight down the center. And, that probably just cracked by having other records, on top of it, yeah. Here's what it actually looks like in a more recent color photo. I can see it's been updated with a disco ball, it's so modern. But it's actually kind of it's a really nice looking thing with the whole shiny. I don't know what the ruffles are called, but it looks really, really nice. I go to a party with this. So last week, we talked a little bit about preamplifiers, where for turntables in particular. And just a reminder, if we had something like a tape deck, which are contemporaries of the phonograph, the first pre-recorded reel-to-reel tapes that you could actually just buy, not usually off the shelf, but you could order them and you could buy them, were introduced in 1949 in the USA. From what I've heard from what I've read is that at the time when they were introduced, there were no popular artists being actually released on tape. In the UK, they came in 1952. In 1955, there was stereo. Here's a pretty popular model, which is the Ampex Model 601, and you've got a Les Paul tape over there. Is it Les Paul or Les Paul? It's Les. Yeah, Les. It's probably like Leslie. Yeah, or Lester. So this Model 600 in 1954, and the problem with tape decks is that when you actually have to make a copy of a tape, you have to make that copy at pretty close to real time. So every time I want to make one copy, I have to play a signal, and then I have either one tape deck or several tape decks connected to that source tape deck, and that tape deck is playing at some regular speed, and all of the other tape decks are recording that signal off a regular speed. You can do it in high speed, but you start to lose quality. So if the whole point of you wanting to buy these tapes is to hear high quality sound, well, you don't want it to be duplicated in anything faster than real time. And so it's really, really expensive because making copies takes time. Every time I want to duplicate half an hour, there goes half an hour of manufacturing time, right? Right now, if you were to buy a tape, pre-recorded tape reel, it's about $50 for a single copy. These records, some of them are 99 cents. Now that's because they've been sort of devalued. Not like it costs only 99 cents to make them, but at this point of time, maybe those records aren't so popular anymore. So we talked about how the preamplifier takes the low voltage signal of the turntable and it boosts it up to a point where you can sort of safely transmit it over cables to other components such as power amplifiers so they can get the music loud, and we can add things like a volume control potentiometer to be able to control that volume. One thing I didn't mention is at the beginning, we have these very, very low voltages and currents, and so we need very, very high input impedances on the preamplifier. Some folks are familiar with this concept of impedance. It kind of works like electrical resistance, only when it comes to alternating currents. And a sound wave is, a signal that goes back and forth, a vibration, right? A lot of you have seen the depiction of sound waves doing this. And so it's an alternating current. Only the strength of the current and the frequency of the current changes over time. That's what gives us loudness. That's what gives us different sounds coming, different instruments coming through. And in order to make sure that the signal coming off a tape deck or a record isn't being sort of altered by the amplification circuitry itself, we need this thing which is very high input impedance. On the other hand, speakers over here, they have to be very they have by design to be very low impedance, and that's because these are coils of wire. They're coils of wire that have that same alternating current being pumped through it. It generates a magnetic field, and that operates against a permanent magnet somewhere inside the speaker to make it vibrate. And with that, coil needs to be very light, which means we can't use that much copper, we can't use that much material. And so it kind of has a very low resistance to begin with. In fact, if you actually measured the resistance across two ends of a speaker, you'll probably get something like only 2 ohms. When it's actually moving, it can go between 6 to 8 ohms, but it's very, very low. So you get these very high currents, which are necessary to be able to generate the kind of power to move air, to be able to overpower the noise of a crowd and their feet and their talking. And that's where these amplification circuits sort of help you bridge that gap. It allows you to be able to take this low current device, give it a high input impedance, and then pump out current on the other hand to be able to overcome low input impedance. Is this animating? Yeah, there we go. So this is a scanning electron microscope of a turntable needle running across a vinyl record. That's actually been coated with silver because scanning electron microscopes work that way. So if you look at the shellac record over there, that's a 76 micrometer spacing. Yes, 76 micrometer spacing between each grooves, and it's mostly a mono signal. And you can find some stereo 78s, but those are, of course, more recent. And nowadays, if you find a 78 RPM record, it's usually mono. These records, on the other hand, vinyl ones that we've got up here, which you can also hand around and take a look at. Both the small ones and the large ones, these are the 12-inch record. If you look at the spacing between the grooves on the very, very smallest of them, those are about 1/3 of the distance, and that's why we call them micro grooves. So they're about 25 micrometers apart. And a lot of the records that we've got here today are actually stereo records. This is what's happening inside this cartridge over here. We've got a bunch of coils that are fixed to one end of the cartridge. In this case, it's made out of plastic, but I've seen more esoteric things made out of wood, for instance. Those coils are sort of waiting for the magnets directly underneath to start vibrating. And when they do that, they generate that tiny little current and a tiny little voltage that's necessary to be able to, for a preamp to amplify it into audible sound. This bit over here, the stylus, that's the part that's actually touching the record, and that's the most brittle, fragile part. I actually have a needle over here that's slightly bent, where that steel cantilever that you see over there is slightly bent as well. And then in between the body of the cartridge and that stylus is a sort of a rubber pivot that allows that allows this arm to sort of go around in a sort of a circular fashion. So it can vibrate sideways, it can vibrate up and down. There are some cartridges that actually invert this design. So let me see. This one, for instance, that's a Koetsu, very expensive cartridge. You can see that they've used wood and everything to sort of like dampen vibrations. That one inverts the coil and magnets. So the coils are actually are actually the part that move, and then the magnets are fixed. So as a result of that, you have this part. The part that moves is very, very light, but it's even more fragile. There is actually a pretty famous 70s disco DJ who was reputed to have destroyed about $400 of these needles on opening day of their disco, and then they moved to these needles later on because these are less fragile as a result of that. But they do sound awesome because they are lighter. The part that moves is lighter. Just to be clear, even though these needles can go side to side and they can go up to down, it's not like left and right is the left channel and up and down is the right channel. You actually kind of move in diagonals. So it's like diagonal this way is left channel, diagonal this way is right channel. And you can sort of see how that will work just from the positioning of those magnets. Right, it's not like left and right is picked up by one coil, but all the coils on one side are actually going into one channel of your preamplifier. All the coils on the other side are going into a channel of another amplifier. Yeah, what's up?
Sorry, I'm trying to understand how when you get stereo, where the needle is.
So the needle's riding in the groove, but the groove kind of like does this. It might the base of the groove might go up, it might go down, it might go sideways. And so if you think of it as it's got this circular degree of freedom, that creates, and any motion in this axis is giving you, let's say, the left channel. And anything in this axis is giving you the right channel. In fact, I have a diagram here that might help. So if you imagine those little divots on the right as being different tracks of a record groove, and then the ideal needle is somewhere is number 1, and the sort of the realistic needle is kind of number 5, and number 2 and number 4, number 2, number 3, and number 4 are all like terrible. Like this is the reason why we do not have real true conical needles, right? Because what will it do is start carving a hole into your record, and we don't want that. We want something that's actually touching the sides of the groove, but we also want something theoretically that reaches all the way down to the bottom of the groove in some sort of smooth fashion. This is what the cutting stylus looks like. This is this is a close-up of the actual, sometimes steel, sometimes let's see, ruby, I think, and or a heated diamond needle if you're making like a single run. Also sapphire, not ruby. They're actually triangular because they're designed to cut a groove. There's actually usually a lot of mess involved in actually cutting that first master plate. When you say get a studio recording from the studio and it says, all right, time to make lots and lots of records, time to make money here. What they'll do is they'll play that tape again at regular speed as a turntable like this is spinning on a completely flat piece of aluminum. And that aluminum is actually covered with a thin layer of lacquer that's pretty soft. You see all these lamps, they're also heating it up, so that it becomes even softer. And then you have this triangular groove that's just cutting this conical, that's being moved by electromagnets. And it's sort of cutting this wave, 2 channels of waves into the record. Those lacquer, what we sometimes refer to as acetate records, not because they're made out of acetate, but because the only needles that you could use to safely play them are acetate needles because they're pretty soft. And the reality, if you just play them like a couple of times, they'll probably wear out. They're not really designed to be played. What they are designed to be done is to be electroplated with tin chloride and liquid silver on each side. First they're covered with tin chloride and liquid silver, and then they're electroplated with nickel. And that is a true master record. It's actually a negative of the record. And then what they can do is then they can stamp that onto hot PVC, which is what this stuff is made of, and you get duplicates. The nice thing about that is that stamping is like super fast. It doesn't take you 30 minutes to be able to actually stamp a record. And if you see one of these machines in its heyday, they were producing dozens of records every couple of minutes.
Are those the platinum records that they have on the?
No, I think those might actually be platinum, because those are meant to be decorative. But I think all it is exactly the same thing, only they electroplated with platinum. So it's a different electroplating solution. Yeah.
I'm always still kind of in the fog when I'm thinking about the 2 channels on the single needle reading 2 at a time.
Yeah.
I always had this misconception that you will have to have almost like a double needle to grab different signals.
Okay, so I personally am not that clear myself. Okay, but let's say this is the cross section of a groove, right? Just a single groove, and your needle is coming down. This is the tip of a needle, and just to make it clear, this thing gets attached to a steel shaft. That's the thing that's going to make the thing vibrate. So this could theoretically move anywhere in a circle, but that makes it kind of hard to understand what's going on. So I want you to think of it really as in, it can move in this direction, and it can also move in this direction. All right? If it was moving, say, all the way to up left and all the way to the bottom left, then all you will actually see the needle do is go left, right? if you were trying to see something that went up left and up right, then all you'll see the needle do is go up. So you just kind of you're adding these x and y axes, only it's kind of 45 degrees rotated to one side, and that motion is being sort of at the end of the shaft is moving kind of two magnets in those same directions, but independently. And as a result of that, the coil is actually picking up independent left and right channels as a result of that.
So up and down is stereo.
If a needle is going up and down, it's a clue that it is actually a stereo, or it's a clue that your record is warped. But yes, it's definitely a good indication that it's a stereo record. But up and down by itself is actually the sum of one of these axes. It's not one particular channel. It's actually a thing that they use in video as well, where they add colors together and then they subtract colors from each other, and then you sort of like recombine these two signals to get all the colors you need. They probably got the idea from records. Did that help? All right.
Okay, how does the quad record work?
The what record?
They have quadraphonic records.
Good question, but I know
They must
some.
have multiple axes in there.
It's or something. But yeah, no, that's a really good question. I know some quadraphonic records were released by just having two records that you played simultaneously. That if you want to do quadraphonic, tape is really the way to go, because you can have 8 tracks, 16 tracks going on simultaneously. You can, by the way, you don't actually have to cut on PVC. There are polycarbonate discs which are thicker, they're cheaper. You can make them transparent, so it's kind of cool. I think I've got one. One sec. Yeah, there we go. This is a polycarbonate disc. Doesn't sound very good, and it's actually transparent. Only they've glued a piece of they've glued a sticker at the back, so it actually shows the waveform of the sound that's actually on the record. So this is a scratch record, so it's the same sound over and over and over and over and over again. So you can do that with a diamond-tipped. Is it a diamond-tipped lathe? No, steel. You use a steel stylus. So if anybody wants to make like one copy of a record, there are cheaper ways to do it than what I just described. The other thing to keep in mind about the needles is that they have different shapes. Not all of them are exactly that shape. There are the word conical and spherical is kind of used interchangeably, but it basically means it is the same width as it is. No matter which way you measure it, say this is the cross section of your needle. If you're measuring it this way or you're measuring it this way, it's the same distance. That's a conical or that's a spherical needle. There are some where if you were to measure this, if you were to take a cross section of this, it actually forms more of an ellipse. Like this is actually measurably shorter than this side. And those actually have better sound. They do a better job picking up high frequencies. Because you can see on the top of the right diagram, as this wiggling curve moves, it sort of has the same amount of cross-section in the groove, no matter how much it wiggles. Whereas a conical stylus tends to go up and down a little bit more. It doesn't ride as well into the groove because it's thicker in a dimension that you don't really care for. That being said, the nice thing about a conical needle, the reason why it has such terrible sound quality is, well, terrible is exaggerated, not as good sound quality, is because it's riding higher in the groove occasionally. It also makes it less susceptible to dust and bumps and scratches. So hip-hop DJs actually really, really like conical and spherical records because they're doing this on the record all the time, and they're making these conditions where it's very, very easy for the needle to skip. Whereas people who play very like techno or house, where you're not doing this stuff all the time, you're just letting it play, or disco for that matter, you probably want an elliptical stylus. The nude and bonded terminology, the nude just means the whole stylus is made out of the material, say a diamond. And bonded, that means you got like a piece of diamond stuck on the end of steel. Grandmaster Flash was the first DJ to sort of like come up and say, actually, we should switch back to using conicals. Because of the way that he was DJing, he was scratching, he was backspinning a lot, and then quickly letting it go. The same thing that I was doing last week. As a result of that, he was the first one to say, actually, I get so much better performance out of conical, even though it doesn't sound as good. The reality is that you're not really going to hear the difference unless you've got a very high quality preamp and very high quality speakers. And when it comes to early hip hop, these were DJs who were operating on a very low budget, so you couldn't hear the difference between a conical and elliptical. Whereas maybe at a high-end Manhattan disco or something, you would have been able to hear the difference. There's a million different ways that you can adjust just the arm on. This is what we call a tone arm, which is what the cartridge sits at the end of. You can adjust the height of it. You can adjust the amount of weight that your needle is putting on the record by turning a counterweight. Let's see. There's this thing called skating, which is if the record were to sort of bump off its groove, is there a force that pushes it inwards towards the center of the record, or a force that pushes it outwards? And the reality is that you don't want either. If it got bumped out, you kind of want it to land back in the same groove that it came off, right? You don't want it to hop forward or hop back. So that's what anti-skate is. It's just like a little bit of torque being pushed on the inside or outside, because there's always torque pushing the record out, pushing the tone arm off the record, because things in motion tend to want to travel in a straight line, right? And this thing's rotating. The goal is to be able to get that particular needle. This is a very, very elaborate needle. I have these more rectangular needles, but we want to be able to get the needle so that it's actually pointing vertically straight down on the groove. So there's a shaft that does come down at an angle, and then right at the tip, there's a tiny little thing, and we want that to land vertically in the groove. However, it is microscopic. There is no way that you can actually visibly tell that it's vertically in the groove. So people have come up with all kinds of paraphernalia. I've got a little, this is called a vertical tracking adjustment. I think that's what the T stands for. And a little gauge which can sort of line up and make sure that your cartridge is at least in the correct position. But whether the actual needle is vertical is anyone's guess. I mean, it's yeah, you could put it under a scanning electron microscope, and then you actually put it back again, and it's probably moved as a result of it. There's also this thing called SRA, which is just internet audiophile flame war territory, so I don't even want to get into that too much. But you might see the word SRA come up once in a while. That's stylus something angle.
So you wouldn't be able to guess based on playing a photo?
You could. You probably could if you had some sort of calibration record, right? Like a pure sine wave or something, and you put it in an oscilloscope. Yeah, but I'm sure I see the sine wave. Now what do I do? Do I turn it this way or that way? It's that's a black art at that point. So a lot of DJs don't worry about this sort of thing. The height of the arm is something that DJs do notice. And that's because that's the thing that they're handling all the time. In fact, I did a party back in December where the DJs were using my turntables. And about 5 minutes after the playing, said, "I think your arm is too high." And I looked at it, it's oh, you're right. And I hadn't realized. I hadn't bothered to check for that. I checked a lot of things. I checked the weight, I checked the skating, I didn't think about the height. So DJs do notice some of these things subtly, but it's more about ergonomics rather than sound quality. Now, I briefly mentioned the RIAA curve last week, so I'm going to go into more detail. RIAA stands for the Recording Industry Association of America. And this is an equalization curve that they apply to recording, and then the inverse is being applied to playback. So the sound that's actually recorded on the record is not actually the sound that the studio wants you to hear. What it does have is a greatly emphasized high frequency. So the sound, the high frequency sound on this, in fact, let me see if you can, did I do this last week? I'm just going to play a record and not amplify it.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, let me see if it's a little bit more, because I have a different needle today and a really loud one, so you might actually be able to hear this. My volume is down. You hear that? It's playing too fast, actually. Disco record. Okay. So you're hearing this hissy sound coming out, right? And that's the sound that's the actual sound of the record. And before DJs actually used to queue up records with headphones, they'd actually do that. Obviously, if your sound system is too loud, that doesn't help. But that's what the sound on the record record actually sounds like. And what they do then is they, when you play it back, the high frequencies are greatly reduced so that it comes back to normal. And any high frequency sounds that you get from dust or just the scraping of the needle on top of your groove, the surface noise, all of that also gets reduced along with that. So this is actually a noise reduction solution. Similarly for the bass that's actually recorded on these records is kind of weak. And that's because bass requires these giant movements of the groove. And if those movements were actually preserved on the record, it might knock your needle out. And so the bass is reduced when recording, when making these masters, and then re-amplified by your preamp. This is a circuit diagram of how they used to do it with valves, because this is a really, really old standard and technology. But all it really is a bunch of resistors and capacitors. It's a combination of filters.
Could you repeat the rationale behind the bass?
Oh, because recording loud bass signals on a record means that the groove has to move pretty drastically. Yeah, like high frequencies are these like tiny little oscillations. Low frequencies are like these big dramatic oscillations, and that could knock the needle out of the groove. Yeah, so it's more of an anti-skip rather than an anti-noise rationale. All right. So that's what's happening, between the vinyl and the turntable. This is a version of the turntable that you see in front of you, which is the Technics SL 1200 Mark II, which for the longest time, I would say at least 2 decades, was the DJ standard. Probably more like 3 decades now I think about it. There's a little strobe light over here that's flashing at some very high frequency. It looks like a steady red light. But all of these dots over here are all printed at an interval so that when it's spinning, and it's spinning on exactly the right speed that the record is supposed to be played at, 33 and 1/3 revolutions per minute or 45 revolutions per minute, those dots remain static because the light is strobing and those dots are appearing in the same place all the time. This also allows me to sort of calibrate my needle so that if I calibrate my pitch fader, so if I can get one of these other lights to stay steady, then I know that I'm at some other rate. Right now, the top row is steady, and I'm playing this record 6.4% faster than it's supposed to be. I'm looking at my gauge, it says 6.4. It's about 6.3, 6.4. It's pretty accurate. But if that was off, then I'd know there's something wrong with this potentiometer over here. I probably need to get it replaced or serviced. So it's just an easy way to sort of check things. There's a little light, just a little. I think this is actually an LED, but it used to be just a regular incandescent light, so that if all the lights were off, I'd still be able to see enough of the record to be able to put my needle down. And as I demonstrated earlier, and I demonstrated last week, this fader over here allows me to adjust the pitch. Basically, it allows me to adjust the speed of how fast the record is playing. So if I move it all the way in one end, I'll give you some audio. -8%, +8%. So I get some control over how fast this record is playing, and I can get 2 records playing at the same speed. Of course, if I slow down the record, the pitch also drops. And if I increase it, the pitch actually goes up. So another DJ might say, I don't really care about the speed of the record, but I want these two records to sound exactly the same pitch. If they were close to begin with and I just want to tweak them, they could. That's entirely feasible. Sometimes you see a black version of this. That is either someone just did a custom job on the players, but more likely you're seeing a European version that runs on 220 volts. There's a little voltage switch inside, and that's the SL1210. Now the reason why this particular model, this is actually a sequel of the 1200, this is the Mark V, but I showed you the Mark II. But the reason why the Mark II became the standard was because of this underneath the hood, the direct drive, which is a very, very high torque motor that sits directly in the center of where the platter is. So it's actually a motor that is directly moving the platter on top of this steel platter on top of it. It takes a lot of oomph to remove it, so I'm not actually going to do that. But that's what it looks like. This is actually a picture from a predecessor, the Technics SP10 Mark III, which had the same sort of motor. And there's a quartz clock in there to sort of make sure that the pitch is not wavering as long as someone's not putting their hand on the record, which is the thing that hip-hop DJs do. This is much more powerful because you're just moving the steel directly. The alternative is a belt drive. On the right, we have a record player where the belt is actually visible. You can see this sort of elastic that goes all the way around the edge of the platter, and then it's being driven by a much smaller motor. So we have way less torque. You can still get very good performance out of that. In fact, there are a lot of people who are hi-fi enthusiasts with incredibly expensive audio systems who prefer those because the vibration that's coming off the motor isn't necessarily transferred directly to the vibration of the platter, and you might not hear that as a result. They've got speakers where you could hear that, and they don't want that. So this sort of isolates the mechanism that's turning the record from the record itself. But as a result of that, you get less torque. You have a smaller gear driving a much larger circumference. Still, that's what DJs had to start with. This is the booth from the Paradise Garage in 1981, and they did not have Technics turntables in there. They had Thorens 125s, which were these belt-driven turntables. They did have a small ±2% pitch adjustment, so you could do that beat matching, where you can get two records playing at the same speed. And ±2% is small enough that you can't really change the pitch you can't really audibly change the frequency of the music, but you can change the speed of it. On the right is the first version of the SL1200, the Mark I, which has a small rotary knob which you could use to adjust the pitch. I think that's right. I might be wrong. It's either the slider on the left or a small rotary knob. I think a small rotary knob. And it's kind of finicky because this is much easier to sort of make fine adjustments. If you imagine this is a knob, like a small knob about this size, it's kind of difficult to turn. Oh, that's another picture of the Thorens. It's actually a gorgeous sounding record player. So, if you get a chance if you are in the audio market and you wanted to get a record player, there's a lot of history behind the Thorens 125.
How much are they? How much?
Depends on the condition, I'm guessing, but they weren't exactly rare. They are made from Switzerland, and I'm guessing there's some sort of European markup. Yeah. And because there's some history behind that, there's probably additional costs. You can probably get equivalent good-sounding record players, for less money, just because of the name. That's Grandmaster Flash over there on the right, carrying a Technics SL23, and that's what he learned and that's how he invented most of his hip-hop DJing techniques. As you can see, it still has those dots on the side, just like mine, only the vertical. There is a way to be able to adjust the pitch, but it is a belt drive. So he actually invented all of his techniques before the direct drive motor was a standard. And it's pretty amazing because it's actually very difficult to perform the techniques that he does, that he was filmed doing at one point. It was superseded by other turntables such as the Technics SLB1, B for belt. And those look a lot more like these turntables, but they have a belt mechanism inside. Here's a quote from him. DJs hated me for this. You're not supposed to put your fingertips on the body of the vinyl. Never, 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 ever. But doing this, just right now, if I hold down and I push hard enough, you can see I can actually stop the platter. The motor is still on and still trying to spin the platter, but if I just exert enough strength, you can see it stop. And if I were to do that, actually, let me just do that on this. Okay, if I actually stop the platter and let go, you can hear the pitch come back up, right? Yeah, there's this sweet sound. So if you're doing this on the belt drive, you will always have to push the record forward if you want to start at full speed. Even now, if I have a light touch, and this is a very strong motor, if I just let go, the direct drive motor kind of just picks it up right there. But a lot of DJs who operate with record players, they kind of get used to giving a slight nudge when you release, because you never know, you can never be sure exactly how much pressure you're actually putting down on the record. So just to compensate, just in case, you let go. Or if you want, you can scratch it. And that will just let it take off at the right speed. So you don't hear that part, it's like when I'm scratching it, I just cut off the sound, so you don't hear me doing this, and then when I want you to hear it, I just turn on the fader. People know this song? Oh, it got reused in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, in the 90s, I think. Anyway. Oh yeah, slip mats. Another thing that Grandmaster Flash he didn't technically invent it, but he standardized the version that we are used to together, which is basically a piece of starched felt. His mom was a tailor. She made clothes, and he had access to all kinds of different textiles, and he tried all kinds of different things. I think the story goes that he Scotch guarded it or something like that to give it the firmness. And nowadays there's a sort of a layer, a sort of a plasticized layer at the bottom to sort of reduce the amount of friction between the felt and the platter. And that's just to sort of make it so that if I have my hand on it, the platter it makes it easier for the platter to stay at the speed that it needs to. Let's see. You also found this sort of felt mats in radio stations, but more often than not, they'd be glued onto the platter. So they're really there to sort of protect the record rather than allow DJs to do this kind of monkey business with the with the record. Yeah, spray starch. That's what he used, not Scotch guard, but close enough. And he called it a wafer because it reminded him of communion wafers that you get in church. But now we call it a slip mat. Let's see. Oh, where are my stickers? Okay. Let's use this record. All right, so you can see on this record there are a couple of markings right here. Before music largely became digital, we needed to find some way to actually identify where the start of the record was, or where the interesting part of the record was. So let me just put on this record. Too fast. People know this song?
It's tricky.
It's like that.
It's like that.
Yeah. Same thing. And Rob Swift played this last night. Yeah. That sound, right? It's like a DJ can scratch this sound. Oh, that's way too loud. So you can scratch that sound, but remembering where that sound is can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So whoever owned this record previously actually stuck a piece of tape probably, it just looks like a cassette tape label actually, just a little bit, just to indicate, all right, if that direction is pointed at a needle, that's where the sound starts. The other thing that you can actually do, that Grandmaster Flash used to use a crayon to actually draw a circle. If you look closely, you can sort of see where sometimes, just the waveform of the audio, in this particular case, is actually split between two tracks. So there's silence in between. And you can sort of visibly see that something's happening there, right? Or in this case, it's silence. But you can also sort of manually do that, and you use like a wax crayon to be able to do that. You can actually use stickers. So let me grab a sticker from here. Let me grab another sticker from a box that's actually open. There we go. And instead of trying to, in my headphones, figure out where that bum sound starts, I can actually just take a piece of tape and actually just put it there. So every time I rewind the record, I'll actually end up there. That wasn't the first. Oh wait, that's a few tracks in. We started from the beginning. This is 4 bars. All right. So I have to try to figure out exactly which groove that was. I'm gonna make a guess that it was there. And now when I wind my record, every time I rewind the record, it will go back to the same place. Whoop. Or it will knock my needle clear off, but that's because I didn't push the tape down. There we go. And that clicking sound is the sound of the needle hopping grooves until it gets to the right place. But that's not the right place, so I'm going to have to move this just a little bit closer in. Now we're talking about 25 micrometers between each adjustment. So that's wrong. Got to go further in. There we go. So now, every time, if my record isn't quite in the right place, it always goes back to the same place. So if I'm doing some sort of DJ battle, and I really, really need to be able to find the start of the record super fast, I'm right there. I don't have to use headphones or anything. Well, that's another trick. But I'm not a battle DJ, so I'm going to take the tape off. Let's see. How are we doing on time? It's almost 3 o'clock. All right. The other thing is, a lot of folks like to, that not just Grandmaster Flash, but this is actually a photo of Grandmaster Flash setup around 1980 when he had already upgraded to the Technics 1200. And what they do is they get 2 copies of the same record, and so that they can play 4 bars off a really, really hot part of the track, and then you can play the same 4 bars over here while rewinding one of the tracks. And again, I did that last week, but the idea is that you buy multiple copies of the same record, which can be tough because at the time in the 1980s, record stores wouldn't necessarily I have 6 copies of the same record. Maybe they have 1. And then you have to go to a different store, maybe in a different borough of New York or something, to be able to find the record that you're looking for. Record players work on vibration, right? But there's a problem when you are playing for dancers, and that is bass. You want bass because people get excited, they want to dance to it, but it also might move your record player as a result, and you get this thing called bass feedback. the sound of the speaker going back into your turntable. It's not nearly as bad as microphone feedback, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, this kind of squealing. And that's because it doesn't continually amplify. You kind of like hear only one loop of it, but it does ruin the sound of the bass. It makes it sound as if you got one particular frequency that's louder than everything else. And no matter which record you put on, that frequency is there. You know, it's not musical. It's not part of the intended studio recording. So blocks of concrete is an actual solution that was employed by David Mancuso. And every time they do one of these parties to honor this person who has been credited for sort of creating the disco scene in Manhattan, that's the part that everyone hates, which is lifting up giant blocks of concrete. Because they want to do it the way that he did. But do we have to do that part? It's like, yes, we have to do that part. And they'll use the Thornton's turntables, because he didn't have. This wasn't invented at the time when he was creating disco. If you are in a nightclub and there's a vibration problem and you don't know what to do, well, you look around and see what material you've got. So what's in the nightclub? Rubber bands and ashtrays. That's over there. You know, 4 ashtrays with rubber bands stretched across them, one underneath each foot. The feet themselves on these particular turntables are designed to absorb a certain amount of vibration. But even then, with a large enough bass environment, you can overcome that. That's why I have these little shoes. They are made of, just a sort of a gummy-like polymer. The ideal material is sorbethane, which was actually designed to absorb vibration. But I've seen people use squash balls, front tennis balls, which is a sport that they play, I think in Portugal, which is actually a little bit firmer than a squash ball, and that works pretty well. And then sometimes they combine things. So they'll put like squash balls cut in half, so you get these hemispheres sitting on the table, and then they put a block of concrete on top. That was the last gig that I played. Like, I brought my turntables, and the other DJs brought the concrete. I was like, that's great. I'm not carrying concrete. Thank you. All right. Does anybody need a break or a restroom break? No. Okay. Just to let you know, there are restrooms both on the left and the right. They're both near elevators. So just keep walking until you see an elevator, and the restroom's right next door. But obviously, the dancers on the dance floor don't care about that. They don't care about turntables. They don't care what you're using to play the music. They just want to listen to music. So one way that a DJ can distinguish themselves from all the other DJs out there, from what you hear on the radio, is how do you pick the right song for your audience? I want to sort of get across from a DJ culture point of view, when you're listening to a DJ, you're listening to their collection of music. And more specifically, you're listening to a selection from their collection that they've selected just for you that day. So on the left, we have Africa Bambaataa. And on the right, we have 2 UK DJs. On top is Ian Levine, and at the bottom is David Rodigan. And all 3 of these DJs are DJs who distinguish themselves. If you read any biography of them, they are described as people who shaped their scene. Hip-hop, reggae for David Rodigan, and for Ian Levine, Northern Soul, which and that will transition into the music that we'll be playing today. And there's very little written about their technique, how well they sort of queued up records, or how well they dropped it, or every transition was perfect. They're remembered for having records that nobody else did. Or for deciding to play records that no one else would decide to play, even if other people had access to it. And part of that is this exercise of crate digging, which is going to places where rare records are, or maybe records that nobody else wants, and trying to find those diamonds in the rough. That's UK in the 60s. If you go to any record store nowadays, you might see DJs doing this sort of thing. I was just doing that last week. You might even do that digitally, or over there's Laid Back Luke, sort of listening to new records that his friends have sent him, the new productions on his computer, and just trying to decide, Is this the thing that my audience wants to listen to? It's all the same exercise of like, can I find this gem that that no one else has yet? Sometimes to sort of protect that exclusivity, DJs will sort of mess up the center of their record, the label, so that other DJs wouldn't be able to see. Maybe they put stickers on it, or in this case, use a marker on it, because there's always someone who's just like trying to say, all right, that's a pretty hot record. How do I get a copy of that, right? Now it's a little bit harder nowadays because if your performance is recorded on YouTube or on streaming somewhere, your commentators are going to someone's going to know what record that you're playing, and then they'll type it out, and then everyone will know it. Yeah, or Shazam for that matter. Good point, actually. So this technique doesn't work so well anymore, and more often than not, in order to get that exclusivity, DJs actually have to learn a little bit of production in order to sort of, I'm going to take this record. Yeah, you can identify what record it is, but I'm going to make a special mix of it that you'll never have. And a special DJ-only edit. And of course, if the record label likes it well enough, maybe they'll pay the DJ to release it.
Are those the ones that are called remixes?
Say what?
The remixes are...
Yeah, those are like special DJ remixes. They're the exclusive. Often they're called bootlegs because they are not authorized by the original label, right? But a DJ... The DJ is only playing it for that one time, for the instance. They're not selling it. So technically, there's no point for a record label to go after them. It's like someone playing a cover of a song, but they're playing it their way. It's like a label's not going to be able to really prosecute you for that. So that's the same sort of sense of a DJ. I'm taking this song that you already know, that you can buy, but I'm going to edit it so that it sounds different. Maybe I'm going to put different drums on it. Maybe I'm going to rearrange the sequence so that it doesn't play in the same order that you expect it to.
I heard that German techno scenes, they try to expose what they did.
Right.
I guess it's because you can't really hide it, so why not just put it on the internet and say,
And it's especially in the sort of the social media environment, that's become it's become like a point of pride to sort of grow the scene. And one way you do that is to let other people know what they can buy, right? But it's still a lot of pride to be the first one to do that, right? So to find a record that no one else has heard yet and say, yes, you should buy this record, which I hope you've never heard before, because otherwise, you already know what I'm telling you, and then I've lost my exclusivity, right? Stores that were near famous discos, had a lot of cachet, of course. There's Vinyl Mania in New York City. It was near the Paradise Garage, and that's Larry Levan over there, which was the resident DJ from the Paradise Garage. Imports, etc., from Chicago. I think that's the one at the bottom here. Was the first record store to have a section called warehouse music, which eventually just became house music. This was a section that was dedicated to the records that Frankie Knuckles was playing at a disco called The Warehouse. And just to be clear, it still sounds like disco. It wasn't really the house music that we associate with it today, but that's where the word comes from. So we'll get to more into house music at the end of the year, of the month. On the top right, that's Eastern Bloc, which was in Manchester, UK, which was near a club called the Hacienda, one of the seminal UK clubs in the 80s. And Soul City, which is, I think, in London, Covent Garden, which actually came up with the word Northern Soul. And I'll get more into Northern Soul shortly. And of course, vinyl markets, right? Where instead of going to a store, people who have stores or large collections that they would normally be doing online retail, something they all gather in one place. And that's actually a number of them coming up here in Boston. So if you're interested, I'll send you the Facebook links for those events. But what if you're trying to get records that haven't been commercially released yet? That's where record pools came in a big way in New York City in the late 70s. That's Judy Weinstein, who was running one of them. David Mancuso, who created this disco concept, his apartment was also kind of a place where a record pool will be based on. And the idea is that labels who want to test out records that they knew they wouldn't get radio play, but they might become hits just through club play, just through disco play. We'll print out a small run and just give them to the record pools, where all the professional licensed, like they prove that they're actually real working DJs. They're not just Joe Schmo from down the block. Only they would have access to it. They'll probably have to have some sort of subscription to it, and then they could come check out these new uncommercial, these not yet commercial releases, listen to them, decide whether they were going to play them. Often they will be these kinds of promotional records, and I have a few of them here actually. I'll pull them out later. Actually, let me see if I can find one right now. Promotional records. Not that one. Well, here's one. Not much to see. It's a white label, and we call them white labels. In this particular case, I think if you open it up, there should be a sheet of paper in there that actually explains what track is on there. This is also really great because then no one can actually know the name or the artist of the record that you're playing, right? There's nothing printed on the record. But often what will happen is that you get a little sheet of paper, a little form just like that one, which is the form for DJs to send back to the record label. Did people like this record? Where did you play it? What time did you play it? Let's see. What's your name? What comments do you have? Maybe there's some comments like, you have a nice intro, but your break is too short or something like that. And the record label can do something about that. If you want true exclusivity, the only way you're going to get that is by cutting your own record, right? And there's different reasons for you to do that. There is this culture of the dub plate, which is the one-off special version of a record that was cut, that was made just for a particular Jamaican sound system. And the idea of this is that if you play this in front of an audience, then not only is it something not quite like what the audience has heard before, it has a well-known singer on it calling out the name of the people who are playing the records. And so the DJ sort of shows, I'm so cool, I have access to these singers. I am so cool, I have access to these bands or these studios. I do not have any dub plates. They're very exclusive. That has pervaded all the way into scenes like drum and bass and jungle, which has this pretty strong sort of Jamaican tradition. And the whole idea of we're just going to cut custom records that only we can play. It's like you can't buy these because we don't know if anyone else actually wants to buy these. But by having these, we have some sort of exclusivity. But there are other reasons too. On the left, Bone is a Bone music record, or Ryobra, which is a Russian bootleg record, mostly of like American rock and roll, made through the 50s, through the 60s. And the idea is that a lot of American music was just hard to get in Russia for state reasons. But the young teenagers who absolutely had to listen to Russian, to American music found that X-ray negatives actually made pretty good dub plate cutting material. So they could sort of make records out of these X-ray films. And you could only play them something like 5 or 10 times. They mostly ran at 78 revolutions per minute, although I'm not quite sure why. And they're all single-sided, and they're pretty amazing to look at, right? Because that's literally someone's X-ray over there. Oh boy, I'm going to skip this. This is way too long. I want to. There's so many different ways to describe versions of music and different formats of music. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we moved records around. Because right here, I've got a milk crate, right? This is kind of classic beginner DJ stuff. It's just like put it into a milk crate, which usually has a sign saying, please do not steal. This one doesn't. If you want to hold the maximum number of records in here, you wouldn't actually insert it this way. You'd actually insert them this way. The problem is that the width of the milk crate is not quite wide enough to actually hold it this way. So they're always slightly cocked. as this picture shows. If that milk, that milk crate could probably hold a few more records, but they're always at a slight angle, and of course you can't stack them because if you stack them on top, you would be bending the records in the process. Also, records are really heavy, so anybody who like grew up DJing with records usually has some guns. As you look through these records, you may notice that some of these records have stickers on them up here. And that's just to help us find the records faster when we're in a dark nightclub. So let me see if I can find a more obvious example of that. Oh, wait, they were all in front. That's right. Yeah, here we go. DMOP, we call it acid. With the speed of the record written down here. This one says 62. The reality is that this track runs at about 124. So, but it's enough information, and it's D. So when you put the record back, it goes in the D section because the group is called DMOP. Whenever a record's being played, usually you will see it cocked a bit like this. So let's say I have the record out, you see the sleeve out like this, so that when the DJ wants to be able to put it back, they know which sleeve it goes back into. So nowadays, if you're a professional working DJ still working with vinyl, you'll have a proper crate that is stackable, that has a lid, and will actually allow you to, and a proper handle. And more recently, satchels that have some reinforcement to be able to protect records, because again, records are really heavy. All right. Finally, before I start playing music, how many of you actually heard of Northern Soul? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So it's the BBC actually made a documentary that I think sums it up a lot better than I ever could. So I'm just going to show you like 4 minutes of this, but I'm just going to state it might have been the first big rave culture of in the world, in groups, of maybe 1,000, mostly teenagers, all gathering in some place in the middle of the night just to dance to really loud music, and this was in the 60s, right? Let me see if I've got audio. Where's the remote control? There's. Why is it not playing? Maybe.
So, picture the scene. Electricity blackouts have cut the working week to 3 days. There's industrial unrest, football violence, terrorism, and bad fashion. Now, I'd like to be able to pretend that as a future economics journalist, I was gripped by the crisis we were living through. But I was bored with it, bored with pop music, and now, right on my doorstep was something underground and dangerous. One Saturday night, I left home with a change of clothes, telling my mum I was staying with a friend. But that was a lie. In fact, age 15, I was going to probably the greatest nightclub in the world. At its height, Wigan Casino was pulling in crowds of up to 2,000 people every Saturday night from 2 a.m. until 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning.
2 to 8 a.m.
Wigan around midnight, and all the ordinary people had melted away. The streets were just full of hundreds of young kids ready to dance to Northern Soul. Take it easy, please! By 1:30 a.m, the queue was about 10 deep. You had to shove your way in and then edge along the wall till you got to the front. All the while, people were buying and selling records and drugs. And as for the door policy, one bouncer and you were in. Stop walking out the back! On the dance floor, it felt like, well, freedom. It felt like finding a new family. And a small part of me is still always there. But what is Northern Soul? All we knew then was that we loved the music. It was like Motown, but rougher, the emotions more raw. This was music made by unknown black singers in tiny studios for local labels in America's industrial heartland. Most of the time we had no idea what they looked like. Some tracks were only ever demos, and for many of the records, only a few hundred were ever pressed. And it was this obscurity that fascinated us. Soul music had exploded into the British charts during the 1960s. But the super cool mods who went to clubs like the Twisted Wheel in Manchester wanted harder edged sounds to distinguish themselves from the mainstream. Some DJs started going to America to dig through crates of old vinyl stacked up in warehouses to feed our appetite for soul.
Northern Soul was about wanting records that had been flopped because they'd been overlooked. It was about finding the hit that nobody else had found. It's artists trying to beat the Supremes, the Temptations and Marvin Gaye, who didn't have the money to make sophisticated records, so the records are slightly out of tune and slightly rough around the edges.
You'll never find a bad Northern Soul record. You know, the quality control is out of this world. Unbelievable. You know, you listen to those records and you think, why wasn't this a smash? We thought that the Twisted Wheel, but we didn't care because we didn't have anything to do with the pop world, you know. We thought pop music was for morons.
The term Northern Soul was coined by music journalist Dave Godin when he noticed that Northern football fans coming to his record shop in London kept asking for heavy, dance beat records nobody had heard of.
I think the soul music you might hear on the radio would probably have been sugary sweet, a lot of them. I mean, a lot of the labels started to add strings in about 1964, 65, and that was to get into a larger audience, a wider audience. There was a more earthy feel to Northern Soul. I mean, I did once term Northern Soul as deep soul with a dance beat. I think it was just a joyous coming together of the writers, the musicians, the arrangement, to create a record like The Velvet's Gotta Find Me Somebody, which is almost like a religious experience when you listen to that record. Just the intensity that's gone into it all.
The Twisted Wheel was shut down in the early 70s, but the flame had been lit. A circuit of all-nighters sprang up. Places like the Golden Torch in Stoke and Blackpool Mecca would become legendary.
Okay, so give you an idea of what we're going to segue into, which is us playing some of that music. Just to give you an idea how north we're talking about, that's the UK over there, and north of England, Blackpool, Mecca, the Golden Torch, Wigan Casino, which was the biggest one of them. Actually, yeah, and this is a fairly recent video. I think it's about 5 years old. They're still dancing. Yeah, only fewer amphetamines nowadays, as far as I'm aware of. It was legal at one point. It was like a dietary supplement. That was my understanding.
What's the name of the documentary?
I think we just search BBC Northern Soul. You'll find it. Yeah, it's eluding me. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll definitely look it up once I'm playing some tracks. So I'm gonna play some tracks straight from vinyl first, and then I'll switch to just playing stuff off my laptop. So what do we have here that's actually soul? Do we have anything out already? Well, okay, all right. Martha Reeves and Vandellas, Motown. All right, so this was what was being played in America. It was played all over the world, frankly, but mostly America and the UK. And switch to phono. So you're actually going to be hearing vinyl because of the topic of today. All that dust, all that scratches.
Crunchy.
Yeah.
Delicious sound.
So these records are all under 4 minutes. In fact, it's really hard to be able to squeeze more than that on a 7-inch record and still have it sound good. And most of them are in fact 7-inch records because again they were made for jukeboxes. So that's the format that jukeboxes had. So DJs have to swap songs pretty quickly, not as fast as like a hip hop DJ will, but much faster than a disco DJ. Let me just make sure I got this working right. Okay, so this is what Motown sounds like, right? You know, I mean, it's like this should be extremely familiar to many of you. I'm going to switch to a Northern Soul song. Again, it's American music. This is American black artists, you know, trying to be the next Motown, and this is what those UK kids are dancing to. It's a lot faster. Is that another record that, oh, there it is. Make you want. All right, so this one should be a lot more familiar. Okay. Oh, why is it not playing? Oh, sorry about that. Okay. You probably heard a version of this song before. And they will clap. They will all clap together. Imagine 1,000 people clapping at that precise moment. Saint Love, the original version. So this was the version that inspired the Soft Cell's version in the 80s. So those kids whom the band Soft Cell heard this song. My understanding is that the frontman for Soft Cell heard this when he was working in the cloakroom of one of those clubs. So he was getting everybody's coats. He heard the song. He ran out and he asked the DJ, "What song is this?" And get away. Imagine 1,000 people all clapping at once. So at that time, they wouldn't be doing a whole lot of like crazy DJ tricks. They're working on belt drive turntables. The early Northern Soul were probably playing on speakers that aren't actually much better than public address speakers that you use for announcements. But it's actually pretty good for this particular kind of music because Motown was designed, like set the standard for music that would sound good on pretty cheap radios. Like they tuned the sound in order to be able to cut through not the greatest hi-fis, and that works really, really well if you're sort of playing on a sound system that's really designed for speech. So even though there is a bass line, there's not actually a lot of bass. You can hear a kick drum, but the kick drum is kind of high-pitched, and all the emphasis is on the voice and on the snare drums and on the cymbals, right? So that's what the Northern Soul scene was about, in the UK. But of course, even in the '60s, the US is already like pivoting to other kind of soul, different versions of soul. This is getting to the edge of soul. It's like this might be a little bit too funky for soul. By the way, this is like the sort of the real formal part of this presentation is done. So if you want to like ask questions, you want to come up and like look through the records, please do. If you want to dance, go right ahead. Yeah. Oh, if you want to look at the cartridges as well, I've got a few here, so you can just sort of see how they look. Yeah. So just you can see how small that needle is.
Last week's thing.
Say what?
What kind
Yeah.
of DJ do you do?
Oh,
Like, how'd you get
I try to be like as varied as possible, but I started out with house music. Yeah, and nowadays I kind of mix more in the hip hop style, but I wouldn't consider myself a really good hip hop DJ or anything. Like I'm just trying to improve in that. Yeah. But I play a lot like reggaeton because MIT audiences seem to love it, and so yeah, and a lot of like EDM techno as well because again MIT audiences seem to like it.
Yeah. You like reggaeton?
Oh yeah. I mean there are a few artists that I like to play. I wish I knew more about soca because that's fun music. That's a lot of fun. Shake it, babe.
What they would play at the Northern.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is definitely a Northern Soul track. Yeah. Let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay. So not a band we normally consider a soul band, but after hearing those tracks, I think you hear the connection.
Calibration?
Yeah, this is a lot like this, which is basically there's two sine waves, one on the left and one on the right channel, and that allows me to control digital playback. So it's the same thing that I'm doing here. I was going to save that discussion of how that works for the last session because that only works with digital music. Yeah. And I try, and I try, and I try, but I get no. All right, so I'm going to switch to like playing more reggae tracks, but just a question: how many people here are actually like into reggae or dub or ska or anything?
That's right.
Okay, all right. So there's a lot actually. I say reggae, but what I really kind of mean like all the different sort of subgenres that constitute reggae, including the stuff that came before that word was associated with the music. In one way, soul music has been described as mixing gospel with the blues. And there were some blues singers who were like not very happy when Ray Charles started doing that, specifically describing it as he's mixing up the blues with the gospel. That stuff belongs in church. In many ways, reggae kind of also is a kind of gospel music, only more closely associated usually with the Rastafarian traditions. But if you go back a little bit earlier, we have rocksteady, which is more of a direct inheritor of American soul music that was popular all around the world. But then when Jamaican sound systems, which we will go into a little bit more next week, these large roaming crews of giant speaker stacks and amplifiers and DJs trying to entertain the crowd for profit, they were looking for more records than they could get from America, and so the answer was, let's make our own records, right? With our own singers. Obviously, they were trying to break into other markets, and this is a fusion of soul music and calypso, and you can sort of hear that. But hopefully, with some of these tracks, you'll sort of hear that connection with some of the soul tracks that I've already played you. Okay, let me switch this around. So rocksteady is it's pretty slow. It's a little bit more on the balladic style of soul. That's one thing about digital music is you never have to clean your needles with a little brush when you're using digital music. So I want you to hear the guitar. Da, 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 da. A lot of soul music actually had the guitar go down on like the downbeats, the ones and the threes. So that 1, 2, 3, 4. When it's rocksteady, it goes 1, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2. And when you get into reggae music, there's an extra strum. It goes like cha-cha, da-da, 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 da-da. And that's kind of one way to sort of tell, am I listening to rocksteady or am I listening to reggae? But the line is really blurry. It's hard to tell exactly where that is. Let me play another track. Where does it keep going? So that every mouth can be fed. You hear the guitar? Da 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 da. Oh, that's this way. Sorry. Yeah, that's my decker. Yeah. So I'm cutting between tracks a little bit faster because I have so much music that I want to play for you, right? The soul connection, this sounds like American church to me, yeah. Okay, so one thing that we get a lot in reggae culture in general, like reggae productions, is we get a lot of different songs using the same bass line, the same rhythm, and in fact, they will actually call those rhythms. Sometimes DJs, modern DJs who have these direct drive turntables, they actually just mix from one song to the other so that the bass line stays continuous. And it sounds like the same song, only you're taking different verses and different choruses from different songs and hearing it all together. So here's a track called Road to Scarville. It's the same. It's a little different pitch. So they're actually playing it again. It's not like they're just using a sample. But nowadays, of course, they would just use a sample. This is called the boops rhythm. I guess because it sounds like boop 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 doop boop 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 doop boop. All right. Let's change genres up a little bit. Well, actually, so one thing about reggae and I would say soul music, disco music, definitely house music, all of these sort of dance genres are very studio and producer led. Often, the bands aren't actually writing their own songs. In this particular case, in reggae, a lot of the performers are writing their own lyrics, but the studio is deciding what tune they're going to play. Right, what is the backing track that they're going to have? Sometimes, a singer on a tight budget will be restricted to using what the studio already has in their archives. Right, I just want to do this on one of your rhythms because you already have them. And so there is a particular genre of reggae music called dub, and this is about the producers showing their stuff. It's like, all right, what if we, we work with singers, we work with musicians, we work with drummers. What if we took all of that raw material and tried to make something new out of it? It's actually a very hip-hop kind of style, and I would say, and it predates hip-hop by far. But it's got that same sort of mentality, only it's not DJs thinking about this, it's studio producers and engineers thinking about this. And then what are all the special effects that we can layer on? How inventive can we be in sort of creating a new sound out of these little bits of other sounds? So let me see if I can play you a track. Do I have to load that up? No, I don't. Okay, all right. Yeah. Those echoes. So, and all of that raw material is still coming from acoustic, right? There's still drums, guitars, and all kinds of vocal performances that sort of interleaved in here and out. It's almost being dropped in like samples. But really, what's happening is that we have a full song playing off a multi-track recorder, 4 tracks or 8 tracks at a time, and they're all being fed into a mixing board that's being looped down into various kinds of special effects. Sometimes it's very often that echoing sound that you're hearing is a tape delay, which is basically a continuous unbroken roll of tape where parts of it are being recorded and parts of it are being played back. And then it goes back to being recorded again and played back, recorded and being played back. And that's the sound that you're getting. It's kind of a wavering, very analog sound. It doesn't sound like a real echo. It sounds like something more electronic, but it's got its own texture. I've heard it being described like this is what music sounds like when you're playing in an environment that has mountains and is very hot and humid, like Jamaica. And there are concrete walls around these recording studio compounds. And this is I've heard some producers describe it as an attempt to capture the sound of what it actually sounded to them. Not like what it sounded in the recording booth, but what music would sound like played live outdoors. One interesting thing about sound, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that sound carries further when it's hot and humid. For some reason, both hot air and moist air are less dense than dry air or cold air. And as a result of that, sound carries much further. And that mostly affects bass frequencies, because high frequencies always travel far anyway, but bass frequencies also travel far. And so echoes become much more powerful, right? Because they can hit something and come back to you, and you still get to hear it, especially if you're playing it really loud. Now, a lot of Jamaicans went to the UK, I guess, definitely after World War II, possibly all the way through the 60s? 70s?
Bob Marley right before him or with him, there was a big wave.
And they all took their music with them, right? And they took that sound system culture with them.
The violence of the 70s in Jamaica. A lot of people
just escaping. But there were also jobs in the UK at the time.
But yeah, it was just like a very particular wave.
Is it the Windrush?
A lot of Jamaicans at some point.
Yeah, I think they call it the Windrush generation. Like there's a particular generation of this huge migration, taking the sound. And yes, and of course Bob Marley is like a huge ambassador for that sound and played all over the UK and America at the time. But that influenced multiple generations of British kids, listening to this. And you can't escape it. This is being played out of giant speakers in the middle of London, in the residential parts of London anyway. And some kids get turned on to it and apply it to more modern instrumentation as the decades go on. So I'm going to play a track from 1995 that I would say is part of this generation. This is by Left Field. This is sounding a little bit more like the electronic tracks that we might be familiar with, but when the bass kicks in, hopefully you'll sort of hear the dub connection there. Echoes. It's a hip-hop beat, but man, it sounds a lot like a dub record that I just played, right? Okay. So that's getting pretty far afield from reggae, so I kind of want to bring it back. Here's a more sort of typical reggae track that you hear from this one is back in, wait, I'll have to check the date for this one. 1980. All right, so I talked about dub plates, right? And about people coming up with custom songs for like sound systems, basically to sort of show how good the sound system is, and the sound system gets to show, hey, we have connection to this famous singer, Johnny Osborne. So this is a song that he recorded specifically for a sound system. No ice cream love, no ice cream sound. My sound is the sweetest sound.
Sound boys, you know our sound is the nicest, is the sweetest sound. Sound boys, no ice cream sound, no ice cream sound.
You can also hear the bass is way louder on the song because they're trying to show off the sound system. Yeah. Now, of course, if you want to have a real bass kick, at some point of time, you're going to start turning to synthesizers, right? Because it's a little bit easier to be able to generate this physics-defying bass. But of course, that was not a transition that came terribly naturally, because Jamaica had this tradition of incredible performers, instrumental performers, who were playing all of these rhythms, precisely and over. These studio musicians who will produce dozens and dozens of records every year. This, I believe, was like this next song I play, like what kind of created a bit of a shockwave, because not only does it have electronic instruments in it, it was pretty much just created by one guy in his own room. And this was back in 1984 by Wayne Smith. It's a little Casio synthesizer, and all the music's coming from that. So the story goes that when Wayne Smith actually gave the demo to King Jammy, who was both the head of the studio and also the head of a sound system, he didn't expect him to release it. He expected him to okay the demo so that it could be re-recorded with live instruments, the way how all other reggae records were released at the time. King Jammy just decided to publish it. It was like, no, this is awesome. It sounds completely different from everything else that we're releasing. And yeah, it did get some people mad, but it got a lot of people dancing as well. Anybody here fans of dancehall? Yeah. So dancehall is another sort of sound system main staple, which it's a bit of a misnomer, because dancehall is not meant to be played in a hall. It's meant to be played outdoors. Like all of this music is meant to be really played outdoors for as many people as possible to hear. Even the people who don't want to hear it get to hear it, right? So let's play another song. I think this is also 1984. This is 1991. So sorry. And you can hear that electronic sound. This one I might be able to mix. Let's see. See if I can mix this. So a lot of Jamaican DJs will actually be try to make the transition as loud as possible. It's not about trying to make a very subtle blend. It's like you want to announce that a new track has come on. So that can be done literally with a microphone, right? You're shouting it out, you're trying to get people excited, and I'm not going to do any of that because I can't do patois. But a lot of these singers on these tracks sort of get started by sort of shouting at people over a sound system and trying to get them excited. And and if anyone's into reggaeton nowadays, this is kind of the heritage of the beat. It doesn't come directly from reggae. Even the word reggaeton has the word reggae in it. It really comes through dancehall, but the lineage is there. Let me see if I can bring it. Okay, let's see if I can do this. So one way that you can announce it is just by doing a spin back, which is like super popular in reggae scenes. So they wait for for the end of a verse. And they just do that. It's like, it doesn't have to be on beat. It just has to be loud. It's a bit louder. Okay, so I just realized we just reached 4 o'clock, so I think this is my last record. But thanks so much for coming. Next week, yeah, thanks so much for that. And for listening. Next week, sound systems, speakers, amplifiers, all the evolutions into like how sound travels through air. Like we'll start to step away from electronics for a bit and just talk about air. Thank you. Who am I? Yes.
That was very good, thank you.
You're welcome. Yep. Yeah, we can see you. Thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it.
Are you familiar with this book?
Wait. Who's this boy? Oh yeah. No,
the guy who wrote
the last one. Yeah.
It's one of the that I used to learn most of the techniques, and I love the.
Oh yeah.
The graphics
match
are
phrases.
fantastic.
Wow, the illustrations are actually really good.
And their visualizations, I think, for people who don't.
Yeah, no, this is
the
really
visuals
good.
are beautiful. Me being a designer, for me, this book was like, it actually like changed the way I understood.
It's actually a lot better than like a lot of guides I see online.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously online you can do video, which helps, but I like that. I like that a lot.
It's like 90 something.
Yeah. Nice. I haven't seen that one, but I've read his other books. I've read Brute books. Yeah.
2002.
Yep. So
and you can almost tell that it's designed a little bit like a website.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of links. Obviously, nobody's gonna type them, but it has like the bars. I think they did it like to look somehow like a website.
Yeah.
But this is cool, right? Like what you were doing.
Yeah,
I had never learned scratching. I should practice a little bit more.
It's fun. It's so much fun.
I saw you doing it last night. It was so good.
Yeah, it was. It took me a long time to actually get comfortable with the idea of scratching because I'm a little bit of an audiophile. I started out as a sound system kid, so actually I started out as a breakdancer.
Scratching is like a antithesis of.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, oh, I'm going to damage my needles. I'm going to damage my record, and it's like, and then at some point at a time, I was like, you know what? I'm a working adult. I can afford a record or two. Hey, thank you for coming.
Are you still using this?
Yeah, I think I'm just done. So.
Okay, awesome.
And it should also be fully charged at this point. Cool. Now, I don't, again, know if any audio got recorded, but I
didn't make any changes to it, so probably not.
Okay.
Unless you were able to actually go into
but I had this.
Okay, cool.
I had my voice recorded on, so I'm